when we look at medical education, we look at the whole process that medical students have to go through. So before they can take any kind of exams to become a doctor, go into a residency program, just like with a lot of other professions, medical doctors have to go through medical schooling. So let's just start out by talking about just some basic statistics. So this is as of recently, 2016. There were 18,900 graduates from 145 medical schools. Okay. So 18,900 graduates from 145 medical schools. Now let's talk about that for a second. So this process starts from application. And most of the actual selection into these medical schools was done through what is called self-selection. So here's probably the best way to put it. Let's say that a CEO of a company retires and they put out a job posting for it. All right, so let's say Yahoo, the CEO, let's say Google, the CEO retires and they want to get a new one in there. All right, so they put out a mass announcement looking for applicants. Now, I, like probably all of you, maybe not all necessarily, but most of you, don't have the qualifications to be CEO of a large company. And so we do not apply. And when we do that, we are in essence denying ourselves from it. We're already rejecting our own possibility there. Same goes with if you are an average high school student, you're not going to likely going to apply to Princeton or Harvard. This is a lot of what happens with medical school. So the people who are going to apply to medical school are going to be the ones who are driven, the ones who have very good grades, the ones who have done well in their exams, the ones who have taken the proper prerequisites. And so the people that don't apply are the ones who likely don't have a great shot at getting in or don't want to go. And so in that aspect, these individuals are removing themselves via self-selection. They're already denying themselves. So let's talk about some other stats. Of all students who get accepted to at least one medical school, about 95% of them end up enrolling. Now I'll talk about it in a minute, but the process of this is very, very difficult of going through medical school. Time-consuming, monetarily speaking, it takes a lot of money, stressful, so forth. So then why is it that 95% enroll? Oh, I'm sorry. Wait, let me correct that. It's actually 98%. It's even higher than that. So why is it that almost everyone enrolls? Well, again, you have to go back to this idea of self-selection. With the self-selection, the people who are going to apply just at the start are going to be the ones who are very driven. You need to take exams to get just applied in the medical school. So you have to go through that process. It takes time. It takes dedication. And so the ones who apply are very driven and very capable. So then once they get in, they already put in all this work. They've been dedicated to it. And so when they get in, they're ready to go. And so they enroll. Now, of everyone who enrolls, medical school is difficult. It's time consuming. It takes a lot of money. It's very stressful. But of everyone who enrolls, about 95% graduate. 95%, that's very, very high. And so if we think about that, right, if you think about just an MBA program or law school or undergrad, the graduation rate is going to be nowhere near that. But again, these are people who are very competent. We talked about the self-selection. Right? They know, they see that when they're going into it, they see the light at the end of the tunnel. They see the money that's to be made. And so it's worth it for most people to push through. And then most people who end up graduating, going to residency program, and then practicing medicine as opposed to research, but not all. So the costs of medical school are very high. During the most recent, or during the 2016-17 school year, the average yearly tuition, only tuition, not talking about anything else, of medical school ranged from $30,000 to $53,000 for public schools, and from $50,000 to $51,000 for private. And that range is within the public versus private is resident versus non-resident. So it's very expensive. However, despite all that, it's a relatively small part of the overall cost of medical school. So if we look at the cost of medical schools, about 46% of all costs of medical schools are from patient fees. So when we talk about how charges and cost reimbursement, they're not always the same thing, what the doctor charges versus what it costs to treat you. Well, at hospitals that are also medical schools, well, part of that upcharge is for teaching future doctors. So a lot of that comes from that. So another 30% comes from research that the school does. Another 20% is from the government. And then, so what does that leave over? 4% is students' tuition, money they pay out of pocket. Now, when you think about that, 4%, all right, that doesn't sound too bad, but again, the average cost of medical school can range anywhere from $30,000 a year to $51,000 a year. Now, over 4 years of medical school, that comes out to up to over $200,000 on average. That's very high. However, that only ends up being about 1% of a physician's total salary on average. So even though it's expensive, it still a lot of the times is worth it in the end. Okay? Because of the high salaries, they're able to make it up, even though it may take time. It still ends up being worth it for most doctors